So welcome everyone. It's really exciting to see all of you here. This is our first Zoom, and so bear with us as we get through the glitches and feel our way in here, but we're excited for the discussion tonight with Tom Stone. Tom will tell you a little bit about himself and how the book came together. But Tom, I want to welcome you and thank you for the book. Many of us read it as our book club assignment. Others of us are here to just see who the names are and where the disagreements might be. Let me ask you a little bit. I just mentioned that you had been in Cleveland and Columbus last month. You told me that you talked to the Houston chapter. I think it was last week, and you were in Chicago yesterday, where some of us attended. What's it been like for you these last few months, virtually visiting these different SABR chapters? What have you gained from it? What have you enjoyed about it? And my real question is, do you have any regrets yet about picking these 30 arguments with these 30 fan bases?
All good questions. So it's been a lot of fun. I think this is my sixth SABR chapter so far. 7 if you include the couple that were doubled up there, Cleveland and Columbus. It's what I was hoping for. I mean, I first approached you and lots of other SABR chapter leaders back before the fledgling season that we have this year got started, because I thought, to help fill the time, like all of us needing more baseball in our lives since there wasn't any season, that this would be a way to do that. And I could cover as many of the major league cities as I could, since my book covers all 30. And so it took a little while to get it going. And by the time things did get going, we actually have the season such as it is, which is fun. So still going forward with it. I'm not going to be doing any more for a little while because we rather abruptly, my wife and I decided to move. We're still located in the Rochester area, which is where I grew up and still live, but we've decided to sell our house and buy a different house. And it wasn't something we'd really planned on, but we found sort of a perfect house for us. But anyone that's moved recently knows that, or any time in your life, that sort of takes over and becomes all consuming. You go on what I call box watch, where you're looking for boxes everywhere. I need boxes. Anyone have boxes? Wrapping paper for everything in the house. So that's sort of the mode I'm in now. So I probably won't be doing 2 more SABR chapter meetings for a little while. And in part also because we have the season to keep our attention. So, but it's been a lot of fun. And in terms of takeaways, I usually walk away with 1 or 2 things for me to jot down for when I update the book, which I'll probably do after the 2021 season. Players that I should reconsider, positions where I need to look at who I chose and maybe think differently, that sort of thing. So definitely some of that's coming out of it too, as I've gotten from some of the Facebook discussions and other things too.
Great. Well, we'll try to give you a grand finale here as you wind down your tour, at least for now. Tell us about the book. Tell us how it came together. How long in the making was this book? That's the answer that when I heard you give it before. But to tell us about yourself and show us these pictures and then introduce us to your all-time Tigers.
Yeah, will do. So as I said, I live in Rochester, New York. I grew up here and sort of out in the country. Now I live in the suburbs. Went to the U of R, graduated back in '95. I work in the human resources industry. Have had a lot of different roles, sort of up into middle management at some companies. And I'm a researcher now. So I'm a researcher in my day job, and then I enjoy doing baseball research as well. This isn't my first book, actually. I co-wrote a book with Cassie Labori on exactly what we're doing here, doing webinars and how to make them more engaging, how to do online training in a more powerful way. That came out back in 2015. And as you can imagine, book sales sort of shot up a little bit earlier this year for that book. There's several books out in that field, but ours is one of the more popular ones. So that was good to see, at least for our book results. She and I were sort of dating at the time that we wrote the book. And I always joke, Nathan, you heard this the other night, that if you can be dating somebody while you're co-writing a book together, edit each other's work and still stay together and eventually get married, as we have, then your relationship's probably on pretty solid ground, because editing each other's words is a pretty difficult task. So in terms of the book and the genesis of it, that's me. I played baseball like a lot of kids in America do back in the 70s and 80s. But in Rochester, New York, like in Detroit, you can't play year round because our winters are pretty brutal. So I played simulation games like a lot of young kids, young baseball nerds do. I didn't play Stratomatic. I didn't play APBA. I played this one, Kadako, the old disc-based game that had the little spinner and the different numbers, had these little spinner discs for each player. So I enjoyed that one. And then when the Atari computer came out, I was fortunate enough to have one of those in the early 80s. And I played this game called Micro League, and it wasn't a joystick-based game. It was a statistics-driven early simulation. You see in the screen there at the top right, you've got the 75 Reds playing the 80 Astros, and then below that, the 78 Yankees playing the 75 Red Sox. Those were some of the great teams that came preloaded in this game on the Atari. But if you got the General Manager disc, which I eventually did, you could create your own teams. You could create just made up fictional players, or you could do what I did, which was at the age of 13 or so, I started creating all-time dream teams and then having these dream teams play each other. So the all-time Tigers against the all-time Red Sox and so on. So I've been interested in this subject for a long time, since I was a kid in the 70s and 80s. I had a few kids on my street that we would talk about the Hall of Fame and who were the best players and so on. Of course, in those days, you had to use the paper encyclopedias like the one on the left. By the time I started writing the book in 1999, we had the internet. It was still new, it was still young, but sites like Baseball Reference came along and really became the go-to place for any research like what went into this book. I started writing it in 1999. I was 26 at the time. Got it published 20 years later at the age of 45. It's a pretty thick book. Those of you that have it know it's about 600 pages. And I'll go through why it's so long as it is in just a minute. I had two editors, one sort of straight copy editor, but I also had Gabriel Schechter as a sort of content editor. Some of you may know of him. He was a researcher at the Hall of Fame, lived in Cooperstown for many years. Little side note about him as well, in an earlier past life in the 80s, he was a dealer, a Texas Hold'em dealer out in Las Vegas. So he knew all the World Series of Pokers. He actually dealt the World Series of Poker some years. And I think he's working on a mini autobiography about his time in Vegas. So that'll be a fun book when that comes out. I sort of stumbled into a publisher, ACTA Sports. They put out the Bill James Handbook each year, and just a small number of other titles each year. Happened to have a mutual business connection here in Rochester, and that guy's brother was the owner of ACTA Sports. So that's how I sort of stumbled into a publisher, which was good for me. And then I've hired Pressbox Publicity, Adam Riffenbarek. That's just the name of himself as an LLC. He's promoted Keith Hernandez's latest bio, Bud Selig's new book, and he's really helped me a lot. He's gotten me over 100 radio interviews, and he also got me on MLB Now. So this was back in February of last year when the book first came out. It's been out for a good year and a half now. And that's me sitting next to Girardi. So this was sort of a bucket list item. First time baseball book author to be able to be on TV and talk about the book. Brian Kenny was off that day, but I got interviewed by Scott Braun, and obviously that was a lot of fun for me. So that's a little bit about the book and the genesis of it. What's in the book, a lot of people have written about all-time dream teams, of course. I took a little bit of a different approach than some in the past. First off, I did full 30-man rosters. I could have done 26-man rosters, but I found too many snubs, keeping it to only 26, and it was too painful. So I gave myself 4 extra spots. I started with wins above replacement for the analysis, just because that's a popular stat these days that sort of looks at overall value for players and factors in offense and defense. Nothing's perfect. I don't profess that WAR is some godlike stat or anything, but I chose to start with WAR just to give myself a level set. We'll go through what my other conditions and methodology were in a second. I give a full depth chart, and we'll see that for the Tigers, as well as starting lineups against righties and lefties for each team. So it gives you some visual ways to look at the players that I chose. If you do the math, a 30-man roster, 30 franchises, that's 900 players chosen for the entire book. So no one on this call, no one that's ever going to read this book is going to agree with all 900 of my picks. That's for sure. And that's part of the fun of a topic like this, is the debate and the arguments that we can all have. Another thing that made this book as thick as it is that I compare my choices with previous authors. At this point, there have been a lot of authors that have done this, a lot of fan surveys over the years. Sometimes it's just one team that surveyed at the ballpark, say. Sometimes it was, say, the Sporting News surveying fans across the country on all the teams at that time. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I compare my choices with these other surveys and authors. A little bit about the rosters, some of the ground rules, because different people that have done this have had different rules for how they went about it. For me, the word franchise is the key word. So the Dodgers covers Brooklyn and LA. The Nationals and Expos is considered one long-standing franchise, of course. The Twins includes their time as the Senators, the Orioles, their time as the Browns, and so on. So I don't have a separate all-time team for just the Orioles or just the Twins, for example. In the case of your Tigers, it doesn't much matter. You've been the Tigers since 1901, so it's pretty fluid. 30 players. I did have some sort of flexibility, but also some guidelines that I placed on myself. So had to have a starter and a backup at each position. In the outfield, I allowed some flexibility. For example, I don't have any teams where I have 5 left fielders and 1 right fielder. You had to have at least 1 true center fielder on the roster. But I didn't require that I have 2 at each outfield spot. I gave myself some flexibility there. And then also for the pitchers, I definitely weighted it more towards starting pitchers. All of us know the history of the game, right? Relief pitching has become more of a specialty only in the past 40, 50 years. And so if you're looking at the whole history of the game, there's a lot more starting pitchers to consider of quality than relief pitchers. So when you look at my roster, when you look at my depth charts in the book, they're not going to look like realistic pitching staffs because there's not nearly enough relievers, true relievers on there. Some cases there's only 2, which is kind of odd to see. I did choose a top 4 managers. I didn't spend too much time on this. This isn't a specialty of mine. I know, some things about some managers, but I didn't go into too much depth. I looked at how did they do during the regular season, how did they do in the postseason, did they win championships or not? But I didn't get into the the important minutia of how well did they handle players in the clubhouse. How well did they do with limited talent? I didn't go to that level of depth. So certainly people like you that are fans of a particular team, say, you might have very strong opinions on some managers I might have overlooked. And then key here is the last bullet, only accomplishments from their time for that franchise are considered. So someone like Ricky Henderson is obviously going to make the Oakland Athletics, but the fact that he played for a lot of other teams, you don't get to use his whole career as criteria for making some team that he only played 1 year for, say. But that's also important on the flip side that some players can make more than 1 all-time dream team. Frank Robinson makes both the Reds and the Orioles, or people like Eddie Collins, Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, they all make multiple all-time dream teams as well. Which brings me to my first sort of trivia question that we can do during the call tonight. Some of you have been on previous calls, so no fair cheating if you know all the answers to this. I had 4 players in my book. If you'd written the book, you might have had somewhat different results, of course. But I had 4 players that made 3 all-time dream teams. So can you think of who those are? And go ahead and use the chat, and we'll circle back to this question in 10 or 15 minutes. Try and think of, there's 3 pitchers and 1 hitter. Who might have made 3 all-time dream teams? Give your guesses there in the chat. We eventually got all 4 of them last night on the Chicago call. But there were some wrong guesses mixed in there too. Okay, so again, my considerations for making it, WAR, I started there. I looked at total WAR for that franchise. I looked at their top 3 WAR seasons. That's sort of their peak value, according to WAR at least. And then I looked at WAR on a per game basis. So I divided their WAR score by their games played. I did that for the offensive players, not the pitchers. And so that gives you sort of a sense of their average value over time, over how many games they played. So I looked at 3 different WAR metrics. Then I looked at traditional stats, of course, everything from batting average and saves and wins that we don't think so highly of anymore to things like on base percentage and OPS plus and ERA and all the stats that we all know and love. I also looked at honors and awards, so MVP, Cy Young, Rookie of the Year, Gold Gloves, any of those things, all-star appearances. Granted, those aren't perfect either. There's a lot of popularity that goes into some of those. We disagree with people that win certain awards. Although I do have to say certain things have gotten a bit better. It's been great to see DeGrom and Felix Hernandez win Cy Young awards, even though they don't have a lot of wins necessarily. So some things do improve over time, I guess. And then lastly, the postseason performance comes into play because WAR only covers the regular season. And some players do great in the postseason, other players choke in the postseason, and so that needs to come into play. So because there's so many nuances and factors here, you can see why if you were to weigh, say, postseason performance more than total value or more than peak WAR or more during regular season or more than some traditional stats, you might have some World Series heroes on your dream team that maybe I didn't because I only counted postseason a certain amount. So there's, if you weigh certain things more than others, you'll end up with different selections. But
This
I
is
tried to weigh all of these fairly equally.
This is what we call a teaser. When we talk about Mickey Lolich, World Series performance will be what we call a variable in where you put him. That's all
Yeah.
I'm gonna say for now.
Yeah, definitely. All right. In fact, it sort of comes up when I did my analysis of Sandy Koufax versus Clayton Kershaw. To me, those are the two best Dodger pitchers. Obviously, they have other greats: Drysdale, Sutton, Hershiser, Valenzuela, Vance. But for the top two spots, if you look at their regular season numbers, Koufax and Kershaw are very, very close. When you look at the postseason, Koufax was great, and Kershaw still keeps coming up short for the most part. So interesting, some differences there. Just to give you a sense for some of the others that I, again, compared my choices to, baseball had enough history. It has a lot more than football, basketball, hockey. But that by the 1950s, we'd had enough history that Sport Magazine did a whole series. They did one all-time dream team per issue, consecutive for I guess it would have been 16 issues. So it was fun to dig those up. I had to go to the Hall of Fame library and find the old back issues and figure out who they had chosen and compare my choices to those, obviously ignoring all the players that came since then. Sporting News did a nationwide fan survey in 1969. You see some of the other books. These are just a small sampling. I've got dozens and dozens of references in my book that I compare with. Rob Nyer had a great book in 2003, just to name one. So again, it's one reason the book is 600 pages, because it has that extra feature that some of the others don't. All right, so before we bring up the Tigers, let me take a look at the chat here. Who made 3 all-time dream teams? Nolan Ryan, correct guess. So Francis and Shirley, good job. He made the Rangers, Astros, and Angels for sure. Stan, those are some good guesses, but only Nolan Ryan made it from there. So Rod Carew made 2. For sure. Pedro Martinez also made 2, for sure. Lots of players make 2. Babe Ruth also made 2, much to the chagrin of Boston Red Sox fans, I'm sure. He makes it as a pitcher for them. So far we've guessed 1 out of the 4 that made it to 3, Nolan Ryan. So you got 2 more pitchers and then 1 hitter. And no, not Rusty Staub. He was, I think, considered for 3 or more, as was, say, Fred McGriff and lots of players. But he didn't make it as the hitter. A-Rod, John got it. A-Rod makes the Rangers, the Mariners, and the Yankees, of course. Rangers only had 3 seasons, but they were great statistical seasons, and so he makes those 3. Grover Cleveland Alexander made 2. Fergie Jenkins made 2. So a lot of guys made 2, but we got 2 more pitchers to go. We'll circle back to that. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Tigers. So one thing you'll see is that there's more than 30 names in this depth chart. That's because, like any good depth chart, players show up anywhere that they played enough games. So Kirk Gibson, primarily a right fielder, but he also played left field and center field enough to be listed here. Hank Greenberg, obviously primarily a first baseman, but did play some left field, so he gets listed there as well. So that explains why there's more than 30 names appearing here. Trust me, there's exactly 30 actual distinct players. These are the guys I chose for the roster. We'll go through it position by position in a minute, and I'll actually show you the stat tables for each position, so we will dig into each of these. I'm sure as you're glancing at this, you're probably seeing a couple of names that are missing, and we'll get to those as we go through things position by position. The DH slot there in the bottom right is not meant to be actual DHs, obviously, because I've got all players that predate the DH. It's just the guys that aren't the starters who are sort of the best hitters that you might use as a DH from the rest of the roster. And you can see here the Tigers is one of the teams where I only chose 2 relief pitchers, Hiller and Hernandez. Could have chosen more. I would have had to leave off some of the starters. Like I say, it ranged across the different teams, whether I chose 2, 3, 4, up to 5 relievers. But in those cases, I had to choose fewer starters. The Reds was an interesting case. They didn't have a lot of great starting pitching candidates, even though they have a very long history relative to the relievers, the Nasty Boys and the 70s relievers, and then Chapman more recently. So a lot of great relievers on the Reds. So I ended up choosing 5 for them as opposed to only 2 here.
Tom, just a quick clarification. I know you're going to talk about third base, and maybe you're going to mention this. When we see Miguel Cabrera's name as the starting third baseman, you're not suggesting that his most significant contributions as a Tiger necessarily came during those years, although he had good years when he
No,
was at third. You're saying he's on the team, and first base is loaded, just as it was in real life when Prince Fielder was there,
right.
and so he's got to play somewhere else, and he did play there, and so that's where he goes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When we see the third base table, we'll see it's pretty weak. I mean, Travis Fryman, there were other people I considered, Rodriguez from the 70s. But when you compare it to first base with Greenberg and Cash and York and others, a lot more good candidates at first base. So I shifted Cabrera over to third. I did that with a lot of players on a lot of teams. I'll bring up the Reds again. A lot of versatility there. Tony Perez I listed at third base, even though he played more at first. Pete Rose played all over the place, right? Second, third, all three outfield positions. I ended up listing them in the outfield because there were other good candidates at second and third. So I do that a lot. I don't allow myself to list people just any place that they played even one game. So for example, on the Astros, Biggio is at second base. I'm not putting him at catcher just because he came up as a catcher. That would feel like cheating. Or Jimmy Fox started out as a catcher, but I'm not going to list him as a catcher. Again, that would feel like cheating a bit. One thing, before we go into this position by position, one thing I wanted to do, as I did last night for the Cubs and White Sox, is compare my choices with those of the recent 2020 MLB Dream Bracket. Some of you may have seen this before we had a season. MLB partnered with each of the clubs and with Out of the Park Baseball, which is a big simulation engine. And they chose, similar to mine, all-time dream teams, and then had those teams play each other in a simulated game format. They didn't have a 30-man roster. It was a little bit smaller, so they had a few fewer spots to choose from. But in comparing what they did with what I did, I felt like, again, a little bit of cheating going on. They started Greenberg in left field. So they looked at the logjam at first, and they said, yeah, we'd really like to see Norm Cash or Miguel Cabrera in the lineup at first. So we're going to move Greenberg into left field. Now, granted, he did play a few seasons there, but to me, that would seem like, doesn't give a spot to Bobby Veach anymore, but also he didn't play a whole lot in left field. So they had Cabrera at first, and they had Cash as the backup, and then they ended up with George Kell as the starting third baseman for their roster. Cobb and Kaline are the other two obvious outfielders to start. And then they had Heilman, they had Gibson, and they had Horton, who you'll notice is not even on my roster. They did have Willie Horton, a fan favorite, of course, as the starting DH, and we'll take a look at Horton's numbers when we get there. They included Tony Phillips, who I certainly looked at, very versatile, could play all over the diamond, quite literally. They didn't have some of the older players. They didn't have Veach, they didn't have Crawford, they didn't have Bush, they didn't have York, and they also didn't have McAuliffe on their roster. So fewer spots to work with. They omitted all those players, but they did get Horton and Phillips on there. In terms of the starting pitchers, they included Bunning and Scherzer. You can make a case for both of them, of course, but they didn't have Bridges, Trout, Mullen, Doss, or Donovan. And then in the bullpen, not wanting to only have two relievers, they had the two I have, Hiller and Hernandez, but then they also added Zamaya and El Senor Smoke Aurelio Lopez as the fourth. So that's what they did recently, earlier this summer. The Tigers in that Dream Bracket tournament won the first round. They were matched up against the Angels in a 7-game series, but then they actually lost in the second round. Somewhat of a surprise, although they were up against one of the best expansion era clubs, the Astros. I know a lot of people hate the Astros these days, but the Astros took life out of the Tigers in that tournament. In the end, it was the Yankees representing the AL, not surprisingly, against the Reds in the NL, and the Yankees took the championship. All right, so here are the lineups that I came up with for my Dream Team roster for the Tigers. Pretty loaded up and down, no matter you're up against righties or lefties. Couple of spots I had some sensible platoons, I think, like DH. Crawford was a left-handed hitter, Heilman a right-handed hitter, batting second in both cases. I rearranged the players depending on left-handedness or right-handedness in terms of the middle of the order there. I did move Greenberg to left field. So while I said that was cheating for MLB to do that, I did move him there just to get who was it? Cabrera moved in and moved off of the hot corner, so he doesn't have to suffer over there too much. What else did I do? I had Veach play left field against righties. Wanted to get some different bats in the lineup. Wasn't able to platoon at catcher, so I've got Freehand listed and full time, although obviously Lance Parrish would spell him from time to time. So that's the lineups that I came up with, righties and lefties. Obviously, there's great players on the bench in both cases that you could advocate for. And while we're here, I thought I would ask and see, anyone recognize all three of the silhouettes that I have there on the right? They're all Tigers.
Go ahead and type it in the chat, or raise your hand if you want to take a swing at all three of them.
Top to bottom. Can anyone name all three, top to bottom?
So I go, well, middle is Ty Cobb.
Yeah.
Top, I'm going to have to say, I just had this. Or the bottom's George Kell.
Nope.
And then the top, it's a pitcher. Jim Bunning?
Nope. Earlier.
Oh,
I think the top might be Newhouser.
Yeah, the top is Hal Newhouser, and the bottom is a bigger name than Kell. Same initial.
A-line.
Yeah, LK line.
His broadcast partner.
Yeah. All right. So let's go through position by position. Starting at first base. So the WAR column is their total WAR while they were with the Tigers. So that doesn't include Cabrera's earlier time, say, with the Marlins. W3 is top 3 WAR seasons. So that's sort of your peak value, your peak WAR. W divided by G is WAR divided by games played. So that's sort of showing your average value on a per game basis. As good as Miggy has been, take a look at Greenberg's WAR divided by games played. It's off the charts there at 426. And then we all know average home runs, stolen bases, and even OPS plus. Keep in mind, for those less familiar with WAR, that it does include a defensive component. Different people have argued that it should be stronger or weaker as part of the equation. And the other caveat to these numbers is these are through the 2018 season. And after I published my book, Baseball Reference, which is the version of WAR I'm using, changed their WAR equation slightly. And so all these WAR numbers are now off by about 0.5 up or down. So if you were to double check my math and go out and look at the site, you're going to find all these are wrong slightly. And that could make a difference, because if you look at Cash and Cabrera, it doesn't include Cabrera's most recent season, but even so, the numbers are slightly off, and I'm going to have to update the book and recalculate all these numbers, edit everything, and they're close enough here, at least according to total WAR. Now, when you compare peak WAR, Cabrera is higher than Cash. That's the W3 column. When you compare WAR per game played, obviously Cabrera is higher than Cash. So I don't think many people would argue that Cash was a better all-around player than Miggy, but I'm just noting that from a total WAR perspective, they're pretty close. Of course, that doesn't take into consideration difference in years played and so on. So again, that's why all those factors being why I didn't want to just look at total WAR. That would favor somebody who is sort of mediocre, played a long time, versus someone who had very strong MVP-like seasons. So here's first base. To me, it's loaded compared to a lot of other franchises, which is why I found a way to get Greenberg, Cash, Cabrera, and even York onto the roster. Although as the Tigers sort of rebuild and gain some talented players over time, and players need to come off the roster, someone like a Rudy York will probably slip off, relatively quickly. In terms of second base, I love Lou Whitaker. I advocate him for the Hall of Fame. I found it bizarre that Alan Trammell got the support that he did, and Lou didn't even make it past the first ballot. I think that's a ridiculous sham. I consider them very similar players in terms of career value, and so I love Lou, and yet I don't consider him better than Charlie Gehringer. So I do think he's the stronger of the two, and so I have him as the starter in my book and Whitaker as the backup. McAuliffe is a great additional player. Again, as the Tigers have more candidates over time, he would probably drop off the roster relatively quickly along with York, because he's only third in this list, but that's not to say he's not deserving as of now. Polanco, Kinsler, easily, pretty obviously not strong candidates. Third base is where I didn't see, besides Cabrera, a whole lot of strong candidates. So it really, to me, came down to Fryman and Kell. Pretty similar numbers here. Their peak WAR is identical, 13.9. That's kind of a curiosity. Fryman played one additional season, so his total WAR is a little higher, but his WAR per games played is a little lower. Very different players, of course. Fryman had some power. Kell was more of a high average hitter. Kell's OPS plus is noticeably higher, which is interesting, given that Fryman was more of a power hitter. So came down to those two. If someone was a strong advocate for Fryman, I wouldn't argue too much against that, but I went with Kell as the backup to Cabrera at third base. And then you see the other names here. Didn't really think any of them were too strong. Rodriguez obviously has very high defensive WAR, but then he's dragged down by his very, very low offense. I always enjoyed watching highlights of him in the 70s, though. He was certainly a good defender. I see, Nathan, you're saying you'd put Fryman ahead of Kell. Tigers Kell, not the whole career Kell. Yeah, and I could see that. There's a lot of things like that in this book where, you know, I'd say 70% at least of my 30-man rosters are just not arguable. Like everyone would agree with them, but a good 20 to 30% could be argued, and certainly a good 10% could seriously be argued, and they're almost coin flips, really. Shortstop was easier. Alan Trammell, the obvious choice. I went with Donnie Bush as the backup. A lot of stolen bases. Didn't really know much about him until writing the book, but you know, not a high average hitter. A lot of people in his era weren't, but 402 stolen bases makes up for the lack of any power there. Looked at some of the other guys here, but I didn't see anything jumping out at me in any of the numbers, the WAR numbers or the traditional numbers. And so I went with Bush based on his longevity and the speed on the bases. We go to catcher. It seemed pretty clear that there were two top choices here, Freehand and Parrish. I think if Parrish had played his whole career for Detroit, it'd be a much closer call as to who the starter should be. I went with Freehand. He played longer for the Tigers, so just overall provided more value. They were sort of similar players in the sense that they were both power hitters. Batting average, although they played in different eras by one generation, were actually strikingly similar. OPS plus almost identical, even their lack of speed on the bases almost identical, 24 steals versus 22, right? So a lot of similarities here. I figured, you know, Freehand played longer. They were both part of an important World Series championship, so even that's the same. So they both make it. It's just a matter of who should the starter be. I went with Freehand as the starter and Parrish as the backup. Some people online have said, well, what about Ivan Rodriguez? And obviously, if you look at his whole career, he would surpass either Freehand or Parrish. But his best years were in Texas overall, and he's clearly makes the Rangers all-time dream team. But I didn't think that his 5 seasons was nearly enough to even really be in contention here, even with the 298 average and so on. Didn't really do enough. And same with Mickey Cochran. Obviously, he makes the all-time athletics franchise dream team, and he was very important in the brief period that he played with Detroit. But 4 seasons, even though they were good ones, wasn't enough to make up for Parrish's 10 or Freehand's 15, in my view. This is a good case, though, sort of the first we've seen from these tables, where, particularly in the case of Cochran, if you wanted to argue based on, say, you know, importance to the franchise in a brief period of time, then you might make a stronger case for him over someone with more longevity. That comes up more with some other teams with some other positions. All right, so a little bit of an eye chart here. We got a lot of numbers on the screen, but I like to show left field, center field, and right field together because I do allow myself some flexibility between these. So again, to remind you, the ones I went with Bobby Veach as the only primary left fielder. I had Ty Cobb in center, and then I included 4 from the right field list: Kaline, Heilman, Crawford, and Gibson. So that leaves off a lot of good players. It leaves off Northrup. It leaves off guys like Chet Lemon. And most notably, it leaves off Willie Horton. That's the guy out of everything for the Tigers that I've heard the most feedback from. How could you leave off Willie Horton? And so my response to that is, you can make a very good case for Willie Horton. And I would not be surprised if more people would choose Horton, maybe over Gibson. Maybe if they're favoring more modern players, they might choose him over, say, Sam Crawford, if they're not as familiar with Crawford or Veach. Or they might choose Horton as one of my sort of floater extra positions. If you like Horton instead of Rudy York on the roster, if you like Horton instead of McAuliffe on the roster, I wouldn't argue very long against that. It's not the direction that I went, but I certainly liked Willie Horton as a player. I was very young when he retired, and he had certainly moved on from Detroit by then. But I remember collecting his baseball cards, and I remember hearing all sorts of good things about him. So certainly understand the people that are big advocates for him. I think less so would be advocates for, say, a Chet Lemon or a Jim Northrup or some of the other names here. So let me pause here, and Nathan or anyone else, if you want to come off mute, you can talk about Horton if you like. You can talk about any of the other guys you see here. Any questions or differences on any of these outfielders?
Yeah, any questions, go ahead and jump in or raise your hand. And we have one or two people joining by phone too. In a minute, I will prompt to see if they want to participate since they can't use the interface. But any initial questions on this outfield list, or I guess anything else up to this point?
I guess I could, I may, be in a minority here, but back to the third baseman. Did Ray
Sure.
Boone, Ray Boone, and of course the longevity was not so great, but in 6 years he hit 105 home runs. His OPS is the second highest on that list.
True.
I was thinking he might at least deserve like a designated hitter role, which you haven't gotten to yet. But, I had a high opinion of Ray Boone when I was a boy.
Yep. I have some Ray Boone baseball cards, actually. These days I collect mostly vintage cards from the 50s and 60s, and when I can find them, the old T206 tobacco cards, but those get a bit pricey. So I've learned a bit about Ray because I have some of his cards, and I think if I were to go beyond Fryman and Kell, he'd probably be the next one. And you make a great point about his OPS plus here being the second highest on the table, for sure. Somebody in the chat asked about Rocky Colavito. I do have him there at the end of the left field list. He only had 4 seasons for the Tigers, so productive seasons to be sure. But 4 seasons when you've got so many other, that's one of the things, someone with 4 good seasons, that's good enough to make an expansion era club. Oh, there's a Ray Boone card. Nice. Thanks, Rich. But 4 seasons is going to be tough, whether it's Cochran or Colavito. The Tigers go back to 1901, so it's real tough to make an all-time dream team when you've only got 4 seasons under your belt. It's not impossible, but lots of guys make the expansion era dream teams with only 4 seasons.
Tom, you mentioned Tony Phillips. Any comments on his placement here as opposed to just about any of the other 8 places?
Yeah, I looked at where he played the most games, and I think outfield overall was the most. And so I don't know if literally left field was the most compared to some of the infield spots that he floated around. But I think outfield overall was the most, and so that's why I listed him here. 5 seasons, very productive. A little bit of power, a little bit of speed, 120 OPS, and just that versatility that was off the charts. But again, 5 seasons, just not enough to compare too well with some of these other guys in my view.
Fred, you have your hand raised. Go ahead. Well, we got to make sure you get off mute.
I was surprised to see how high Tony Phillips did rate on the WAR. And
Yep.
I was actually quite surprised to see how low Harvey Keene did rate. Harvey Keene had the most hits in the American League between 1953 and 59. And over a 7-year period, he had 3 more hits than Nellie Fox. And he was good enough to be traded for Colavito. So I was a little surprised that Keene wasn't on there as a utility man. rather than McAuliffe. But I guess if I were putting it together, I would have put Tony Phillips as my utility man.
Utility, right.
After seeing the numbers.
Yeah.
And actually, Keene just didn't make the cut. I thought he was better than I thought he would have been a better choice than McAuliffe, though, for a utility spot, because he played short, he played center field.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a case where I think you look at, he made the All-Star team 7 years in a row there. Having the most hits in the American League, won a batting title. I just thought that he deserved a little recognition, and he didn't get much. But ultimately, I left him off also when
Phillips.
Yeah, I just couldn't override what Phillips did there. And as I think back about Tony, the teams weren't that great when he was there, but he was really a good ball player. So
yeah. So we would need to dig into it a little. My guess is that Keene's WAR numbers suffer a bit because I'm assuming his defensive WAR contribution is lower than either McAuliffe's or certainly Phillips. Would be my guess.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. But I'm wondering about the WAR defensive numbers, and I haven't had a lot of time to look into them, but I think there's some problems there. And if I'm reading it right, the two best right fielders in baseball for fielding at one point were Roberto Clemente and Al Kaline. And I looked at their career numbers, and I think Clemente was like 12 WAR for defense, and Kaline was like 2.7.
Yeah,
and I'm
that's
thinking,
questionable.
That's not very accurate, I don't think. And so I think keeping Keene off for defense, I read things in history where they thought he was a good center fielder. So I guess I just don't think they valued his offensive contribution enough. And then I guess the other thing I'd comment on is, when I think about left field, I think about, first of all, because, I started following baseball in 1961, I think about Rocky Colavito. I mean, he was like everything. And then Willie Horton came up in 64 and 5, and I was surprised that I would agree with a team that didn't have them on, but I have to agree with you, Tom. They just didn't make the cut. And I was also shocked that I agree with you on Kirk Gibson. And maybe it was because Sparky set the expectations for Gibson that he was going to be like Mickey Mantle, but I just never thought he had that great of a career in Detroit. And when you actually look at the numbers, he did have a pretty great career.
Yeah.
So I guess.
Yeah, he was injured, unfortunately, often, not just famously for the Dodgers in '88, but he had some injuries in Detroit. But he had a good combination of home runs and stolen bases, power and speed, and when he was playing, and yeah, for me, Gibson was important to the '84 Tigers in the same way Horton was important to the '68 Tigers. So that's kind of a wash, and look at it a lot of different ways. You're absolutely right about the expectations. I remember being a kid and reading in the sporting news about this guy, Kirk Gibson, coming up. I mean, there were several guys like that were touted as the next, I think Cesar Cedeno in the 70s was touted that way. Kirk Gibson, Eric Davis later. And they never, each of them never really measured up to Mantle, of course.
So I guess I agreed with every position pick that you had. The only change I would have made is put Tony Phillips in for Dick McAuliffe, although I really didn't like doing it. But
yeah, well, MLB agreed with you. They included Phillips and Horton, and didn't have McAuliffe on their dream team roster that they did earlier this year. So they found a spot for Phillips and his versatility for sure.
Tom, a question in the chat from Mitch about the role of Gold Gloves and maybe postseason awards generally. And in particular, any way we can get Mickey Stanley in the mix.
Mickey Stanley, yeah. So Gold Gloves did play a role. If there was an infamous Gold Glove, like say Derek Jeter or some of the other ones that have been handed out, I know about some of these things, so I take that into consideration. But certainly if what I like to say with all-star appearances and Gold Gloves, if someone was an 8-time All-Star and someone else was only a 2-time All-Star, same thing with Gold Gloves, you know, it's going to count for something. When I looked at the Cubs last night, we talked about that with Andre Dawson. He continued to win Gold Gloves in Chicago, even though his defense by then was not nearly what it was in Montreal. So again, that's the kind of thing I know, and so I would take that into account when looking at those Gold Gloves that he was still winning. Mickey Stanley, I'm not sure how we get him on there. Maybe if we had a 40-man roster, when we expand to 40-man in September, then we can add in all these additional guys.
Or if the shortstops don't start hitting, you just slot them in at shortstop. We tried that and it worked.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that would be certainly a way to, again, get rid of some of the snubs. I mean, imagine, you know, with 4 less spots, there'd be even more snubs than what I had. If you feel like I've snubbed either Horton or Phillips or Colavito or some others, if I had 4 or 5 less spots to work with, there'd be that many more tough choices.
Before we move on, we have one participant on phone and a couple without video. I just want to give them a chance to chime in if they would like. I want to make sure that we don't crowd them out. Otherwise, are there any other questions? And then I think, Tom, you want to get to the pitching staff?
Yeah, we'll get to the pitching staff and then do a couple fun things to wrap things up.
Hey, this is Tony Oliver. I have a quick one. It's a great book. I read it about 6 months ago, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. As you're doing your sessions with the specific chapters and the rabid fan bases that exist within each one, have you found that overall people hold truer feelings or perhaps more passionate feelings about those players that had longer careers or those who had shorter but perhaps more productive careers? And I'm a Boston guy, by the way.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So like Fred was talking about Colavito, you know, short time in Detroit, but was important to him when he was younger, you know, following the Tigers. But then the players that were there a long time, like Jerry Grody for the Mets, there'll be advocates for him to make it as one of the catchers because he handled Seaver and Kuzman so well, or you know, just various guys like that were there a long time, but maybe weren't that much better than an average player in terms of WAR and things like that. But they were such a mainstay and they were such a big part, particularly if it's during your childhood. I mean, that's where the emotions and the subjectivity really come into play. And a lot of people on these calls have been, you know, fully admitting that, like, what about my favorite guy, this guy or that guy? Fortunately for me growing up, my 2 favorite guys are clear cut for their respective teams. Willie Stargell for the Pirates. I've been a long Pirates fan, so he clearly makes the Pirates dream team. And then pitching wise, I threw sidearm and even submarine once in a while. And so Dan Quisenberry was a favorite of mine, and he clearly makes the all-time Royals. So I'm lucky that my 2 favorite players have pretty secure spots.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Mine is Lou Whitaker, Tom, and I think you put it just right. He's so good. He's a bona fide Hall of Famer. He has the edge over Gehringer in home runs, but I think you're right. Gehringer is just a little bit better, and they're both top 10, top 15 second baseman all time.
That's
and,
right.
Whitaker would start on a lot of other of these 30 teams.
Totally.
But just not this one. And I can't disagree. Maybe I can with my heart, but not my head.
Yeah, there's some interesting positions like that on different teams. Like for the Braves, they have Eddie Matthews and Chipper Jones at third base. I mean, only one can be a starter. Shortstop, Archie Vaughn, great shortstop for the Pirates, but there's no way he's starting over Honus Wagner, right? The Yankees at catcher, totally loaded. You have to go with Berra as a starter, but that means Dickey and Posada and Munson. I mean, there's a lot of great catchers there. And really, most teams have one position where there's someone like that, like the Whitaker-Gehringer situation here for the Tigers. So it's funny how randomness would dictate that. There's a lot of names, a lot of years, a lot of history here, that there would be hot spots on certain teams and also weak spots for certain teams as well. And there certainly are plenty of those. We saw that last night with the White Sox, where they had a couple of good outfielders that made it, but I was having to dig a little deep to find 6 that were quality, even though they've been around for a while too.
The only thing I was going to say to that is that I thought Whitaker has the advantage only because he had better numbers towards the latter part of his career than Gehringer did.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you look at his numbers the last years, Whitaker was hitting with a little more power and actually hitting pretty good with average too. So
And I like that. I like that about guys when they sort of kept getting better at their craft. Dwight Evans for the Red Sox is that way. Like his power went up late in his career. Ozzie Smith was that way. He started off as a horrible hitter when he first came in the majors. Clearly was a glove man only, right? He got traded for Gary Templeton. That trade didn't work out so well for the Padres, but then you know, Smith learned how to hit better and obviously was running the bases and obviously the defense. So I love players like that continue to hone their craft. I mean, today Trevor Bauer, you know, leave aside some of his antics and some of what he has to say on Twitter if you want, but I mean, he keeps honing his craft and keeps getting better as a pitcher.
yeah, I think with Evans and Smith, I think it's a product of, despite what Sparky Anderson hated the most, which was weightlifting. I mean, I think Smith and those guys, because in the 80s, it was 84, 85, when those home run numbers started creeping up, and it was a lot to do with weightlifting, quotations, but
Yep.
but still, those power numbers started getting better. But that was a emphasis on changing training for a lot of those players then.
Well, yeah, and if you just broaden the concept out from weightlifting to conditioning, I mean, that's why Nolan Ryan could pitch as long as he did, because he kept up the conditioning and in addition to being sort of a freak of nature, we all have to say.